Hey guys, hope you had a good weekend. We're going to jump right back in this week. Last week you learned how to solve a quadratic by graphing, and we're going to continue our quadratic unit. We have several other ways to show you how to solve quadratics, and so depending on what you see, you're going to choose by the end of this which way is the best way to solve, depending on what kind of quadratic equation you have. So the next way that we're going to solve quadratics is by square rooting. And so in order to do that, we want to be really good at simplifying square roots. So we're going to take a couple days and review how to simplify square roots. Okay, so grab a pencil and some paper. Pause the video anytime you need to, and make sure you're taking good notes, because tomorrow on your worksheet you have 15 problems. And if you take good notes today, then 5 of the problems for your worksheet tomorrow, you'll already have the answers to from your notes for today. Okay, so again, we are going to be simplifying square roots. And the first thing we want to do is we want to make a list of all the perfect squares. Okay, so perfect squares are when we see a square root and we know the answer. Okay, so for instance, we know that 1 times 1 equals 1. And so we know that the square root of 1 is 1. We know that 2 times 2 equals 4. So we know the square root of 4 is 2. Okay. We know 3 times 3 is 9. So the square root of 9 is 3. We know the square root of 16 is 4. We know the square root of 25 is 5. We know the square root of 36 is 6. We know the square root of 49 is 7. We know the square root of 64 is 8. We know the square root of 81 is 9. We know that the square root of 100 is 10. We know that the square root of 121 is 11. And we know the square root of 144 is 12. And so we want to kind of make that list all the way up to 12, because that'll help us. So pause right now and make this list on your paper, and you can use it today and tomorrow. It'll come in handy for both. Okay, so our first example today is square root of 128. So when I see that, I want to take this square root, and I don't automatically know the answer to it. But I do know that if I see one of my perfect squares from the list I just made, then I would know the answer to that. And so I want to try and break this down into 2 different square roots that I can multiply together, where one of them is a perfect square. Okay, so for example, I know that 128 is divisible by 2, it's divisible by 4, it's divisible by 8, it's divisible by 16. 4 is a perfect square, 16 is a perfect square, but I want to find the biggest perfect square that goes into it. Okay, so as I'm looking at this, I'm going to try some different things. I'm going to try, I know 100 won't go into it. I'm going to try maybe 81. 81 does not work out perfect. And how I try this is I just, in my calculator, 128 divided by 81. If it works out perfectly, then that's a factor. Okay, but 81 is not a factor. But then when I try 64, that is a factor. So you'll notice that 64 times 2 equals 128. So I can rewrite 128 as the square root of 64 times the square root of 2. That's the exact same thing. I just rewrote it as two separate square roots that can be multiplied together. Now, I know the answer to this. I know that the square root of 64 is 8. Okay? The square root of 2 does not simplify. Okay? It does not work out perfectly. So I'm just going to leave it as square root of 2. And then I'm going to put plus or minus, because when I'm multiplying 2 numbers, 2 positives make a positive, but I also know 2 negatives make a positive. And so just like 8 times 8 equals 64, negative 8 times negative 8 would also equal 64. So this is plus or minus 8 square root of 2. And that would be the simplified version of square root of 128. Okay, so let's do another one. Your second example for today is the square root of 30. Okay, so I want to think of some factors of 30. This is a little bit smaller, so I'm going to list all the factors I know of 30. I can do 1 times 30. I can do 2 times 15. I can do 3 times 10. Or I can do 5 times 6. In all of these factors, none of these numbers are perfect squares. None of these numbers are on my list of numbers that I made at the beginning of notes. And so what that tells me is that this cannot be simplified. So square root of 30 is as simple as it gets. Okay? The next one we're going to look at is the square root of 20. And so my factors of 20 are 1 and 20, 2 and 10, or 4 and 5. And I notice 4 is a perfect square, so that's how I want to split this up. I want to rewrite square root of 20 as square root of 4 times the square root of 5. Because I know that the square root of 4 is 2. It's actually plus or minus 2. It could be positive 2 times positive 2 equals 4, or negative 2 times negative 2 equals 4. And then square root of 5 does not work out nicely, so I'm going to just leave that. So that is simplified. Square root of 20 simplifies to plus or minus 2 square root of 5. Okay, number 4, we're going to do square root of 75. Okay, can you just look at this and tell what is divisible by, what's a factor of 75 that's a perfect square, the biggest factor you can think of? Okay, well, if we think of money of quarters, 3 quarters equals 75 cents, right? So I could do 25 times 3, and 25 is a perfect square. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to split this into square root of 25 times the square root of 3. And I know that the square root of 25 is plus or minus 5. The square root of 3 doesn't work out evenly, so I just put it on the end. So that is square root of 75 simplified, plus or minus 5 square root of 3. Okay, our last one today is the square root of 45. Again, I'm looking for a number that's a perfect square that is also a factor of 45. So the biggest number that's a perfect square and a factor of 45 is 9. 9 times 5 equals 45, and 9 is a perfect square. It's in our list from the beginning of our notes. So I'm going to rewrite the square root of 45 as the square root of 9 times the square root of 5. And I know from my list that the square root of 9 equals 3. Okay, we're going to do plus or minus 3, and then the square root of 5 doesn't work out evenly, doesn't work out nice. It's a big long decimal, and so I just leave it as it is. And so when I simplify the square root of 45, I get plus or minus 3 square root of 5. And that's all for today. So make sure you take really good notes, and you're writing all of this down for tomorrow, and that you listen and understand. And that's all you have for today. Tomorrow, you're going to do some examples of this. Make sure you let Ms. Kellerman or I know if you need any help. We both have office hours during the day, and you can join the Google Classroom, Google Meet, and ask us questions, and we can work through some of these with you if you need any help. All right, have a good day, guys.